Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSPmagazine. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. We are here live at RSA with Kayla, and we've had a bit of a calendar mishap, so we've had to switch our guests around. Unfortunately, Sonal and Bryson are both accounted for at this time right now. Luckily enough, in an emergency, we have Dr. Chaz here to fill in. So Chaz, obviously you know Kayla and I.
I do.
We all worked together in the past.
Yep.
Yes.
Love for our viewers to just get a quick introduction to you, your background, and then we'll introduce the topic and really start having a conversation that people might enjoy.
Awesome. Yeah, so my background is I did a PhD in computer security, where I focused on work that was at the intersection of kind of data science, networking, machine learning, security. So, my background kind of is a lot of looking at kind of internet scale kind of vulnerabilities and emerging threats, and kind of have brought that with me subsequently from like managing students to managing teams of like researchers in the industry setting. Yeah.
It's very interesting. Obviously a very diverse set of topics, and I know today Kayla and I really planned on talking about big elephants in the room.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Vulnerability definitely goes in that, risk management, asset management. Yeah. There's a wide disparity of events that go into threats, threat modeling, and research. And I think one of the big things Kayla and I really wanted to talk about is, the importance of pen testing.
Yeah.
So Kayla, I think when we were talking about the idea, obviously you and I had been through a couple iterations of pen testing together in our previous role, and you've obviously seen a lot more being in the executive management and leadership roles, whereas I've always been on the outside, obviously customer success focused. So bringing customer requests, customers understanding what a pen test is for us.
Right.
So really, I think one of the things that we should do, a lot of people hear the word pen test. Internally, we often tend to freak out. Yeah. Externally, we have to produce a report that our customers can consume. So at the base, what is a pen test?
Yeah, that's great. And again, it's kind of nice that you mentioned it's kind of a scary thing for a lot of people when they hear it. But the good news is it's really for your benefit. So the first thing to know is it's for your benefit, but it's also kind of like your opportunity to kind of have someone simulate what a real life attacker might do to your own infrastructure.
Right.
But have this come from a friendly source rather than somebody who you don't want breaching this. So you'll have people that will come in and test a variety of different parts of your infrastructure, and some of this could bridge the physical world. So there could be physical pen tests, and there could be pen tests that are focusing more on the software network side of things. And so they're going to come in and look for vulnerabilities in your infrastructure, whether it be physical, software, network, and they're going to try to identify what those are in your own network so they can produce a report telling you, here are the places where you're potentially vulnerable, and that somebody could come in and exploit that. And so really this is a thing that's good for you, and it gives you just a kind of, if you don't know where to start, it gives you a base of here are things that I can easily address.
Yeah, and I think, looking at it through the lens of GRC and the customer impact, when you have a pen test and you have one scheduled, there's a hesitation sometimes that you see in a company to be like, well, we're not going to give you the keys to our kingdom. Mm-hmm. And that's really, I think, a disadvantage, because to your point, it gives you a report of those potential areas of weakness, so you can be proactive and address it. Yeah. And then, nothing's 100%, but really lower the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited. Right. And you can make a decision around it as well. Yeah. Correct?
Exactly. So that's the great thing, is that often with the pen test, they can come back with a list of here are the high priority vulnerabilities and things, so that you can actually use that to prioritize things that I want to focus on the things that have the highest impact, or I want to focus on covering the breadth of things that I can quickly address. Because some of the things that are high impact may be hard to actually go about patching and fixing, and some things may be easier, and they can help in the report kind of identify what those are so that it gives you somewhere to start so that you're not just trying to figure all this out yourself.
Yep.
And so it's helpful, and this is like one of those things that's a snapshot in time, where like they're going to come in, they're going to identify these things, and your environment may be changing, but this is at least a good starting point.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly where we talk about pen testing and the GRC worlds colliding. GRC looks at processes, risks, and controls, and to your point, you might have a high impacting vulnerability that has mitigating controls. So on the surface, it looks like it's critical or high. Maybe it's not, maybe it's really a moderate and low, and you can best utilize your resources based on your own risk posture, what your executive management is going to want to risk accept or focus on. You can really prioritize based on your corporate objectives. And then, things that I've experienced, as I'm sure the both of you have as well, there usually isn't enough people to operationalize those controls. And I think that's where kind of some of the research that you've been involved in and that you've seen firsthand around AI and ML.
Yeah.
And could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, right now, this is a period of time where I think a lot of people are hearing a lot about AI and ML, especially with like the large language models like, GPT-3, GPT-4, ChatGPT, all these things leveraging these large language model. Seems like everybody has their own LLM at this point.
Yes.
And there's a lot of things that these bring to the table. Like one of these is like the unique ability to kind of summarize and kind of, talk about, distill things into smaller, kind of more digestible piece of information. And like, this is maybe somewhere where like, if you're not sure where to start with like, a report from a pen tester or something like this, you could actually maybe feed one of these reports into one of these large language models and ask it to summarize it for you, and it could maybe distill this down for you. So now you've gotten like a very deep view, and now you can maybe have it like summarize it for me like I'm 5, and like you get that, explain it to me like a 5th grader,
And I think that the audit purposes and the automation really help empower your field-facing teams.
Yes.
So, oftentimes, like you said, we don't want to give everyone keys to the kingdom, right? We don't.
Right.
There's competitive advantage, there's competitive disadvantage, right? Things can be used against you and marketing resources and everything, but one of the most important things is that customer wants to know what's going to impact me, what's going to impact my business operations. So I think using LLMs, because we don't have enough acronyms, to reduce the language or the necessity of the information found within the report to deliver something both customer-facing or customer-friendly, I think it softens the delivery.
It does, yeah.
And I think that it kind of takes the pressure off the delivery team and the internal team to either immediately patch things that, like you said, might not be the most critical, they just might be the most apparent.
Right.
And it allows us to strategize and to get direction from the executive management team with input from security and base that on our controls and our coverages to really produce or deliver something that customers aren't just going to dismiss.
Right.
Right? I think that oftentimes, especially internally, we'll go back and we'll say, hey, we got this pen test report.
Yeah.
Let's focus on the top 5 criticals. Are they customer impacting? Are they, are they compromisable? What is vulnerable?
Right.
And how do we discuss that openly? Whereas now, if we're using automation and LLMs to reduce that language, it becomes a much more natural conversation.
It does, yeah. And I think the other interesting thing here is like, there's that idea of like, you get vulnerabilities. Now what do I do with them, right? And so this is a case where now you can maybe leverage the fact that these models have been trained on a corpus that's the internet, and so there's a lot of information about how do I deal with certain types of vulnerabilities on the internet. So you can ask them like, hey, I need some security policies around this to be more proactive in the future so that I don't have more vulnerabilities like this. And you can maybe use that as a starting point to suggest what are security policies that could help protect me in the future, and use them as from going from like just the raw kind of vulnerabilities to policies that might help you protect you in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel as a CISO and also wearing that GRC security risk hat, so many people say stay away from ChatGPT. It's it's dangerous. Don't put corporate secrets out there.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that when it comes to things like this, where it's vulnerability management, pen test findings, the dreaded Log4j, I don't know if anyone's asked about Log4j and ChatGPT. If you haven't, it's fun. So, would you say it's something that maybe security teams should embrace? Is this move to AI, ML, for these types of use cases? And if so, what's the parameters around that when it comes to secrets management and the keys to the kingdom?
I think that's a great question, because I think this is one of those things where, like with a lot of kind of new, useful technologies, there are also kind of all these unintended consequences, right, that usually come here. And like in the early days, early adopters are going to incur a lot of those kind of unintended consequences because they're trying to be early adopters. And I think we've seen some of the privacy concerns around like what happens when you start to share things with these large language models pop up. We've seen this with Samsung was releasing, where they had internal engineers using it to ask it questions about products they were developing internally, and so there was proprietary stuff that was getting leaked to the language models. And while that data gets used to refine that model for a given session, we don't really know what happens with it after that, right? So you've asked questions, giving it maybe specifications for products, and it's giving you feedback back. We don't know whether that's ever going to get incorporated back into the larger model, in which case everybody can ask, and now they're going to have maybe information about this proprietary thing you were building that is really useful, and they're going to get that in their feedback in the future. So that's something that you definitely need to be considerate of, is what I'm giving to this large language model something where if it got out, it would hurt the proprietary kind of knowledge that I have around my company, or leak potentially sensitive information.
Right.
I think another thing that I hadn't thought of up until now, speaking of elephants in the room, is one of the key things you said is proprietary information, but we never classify exactly what proprietary information is. Environmental variables are proprietary information. So if you're feeding an LLM your environmental variables, I'm running this operating system on this release with these security patches, or I have this security tool installed and I'm running into this error, right? So now you're feeding an LLM your exact environment variables, the exact security stack you're running, and the issues you're running into. So, I mean, to your point, it could be used in an offensive way to gain a foothold if that data was ever reincorporated back into the feedback. You could see that there's now a mapping of, we see in financial institutions, this is what a typical infrastructure looks like, and now we're empowering, not just the people trying to protect us, but the people that are trying to attack us. We're empowering them to understand footprint on a much larger scale with a lot less effort.
Absolutely. And I think you're also trusting this data to the data protection of a third party that you're giving it to. And if you don't know what that is, then even if the model itself doesn't leak it, that underlying raw data is now in somebody else's control. So if that was any sort of customer data, clearly that's maybe going to violate a lot of different policies. And again, you've also leaked a pen testing report potentially to somebody, and that means that now if an attacker were to grab that, they now have a full report of where all your vulnerabilities are, and depending on how good you are at patching them, they might be very vulnerable.
Yes, no, that's a really good point. And that's, I think, where risk management, again, comes into play. And according to a SANS survey from 2021, only 29% of organizations have automated 70% or more of their security, controls. So
that's less than a third, by the way.
Thank you. Should we call you Dr. Taylor?
Dr. Taylor.
Mathematician. Thank you.
No, seriously. That is
you're right.
less than a third.
Doing only up to 70% or more. There's still a gap. It's bad. So we're talking about being very careful with the information that we're putting into these large language models, trying not to use the acronyms. We're talking about privacy risk here. We're talking about pen testing, which exposes vulnerabilities that are there that are risks in and of themselves. So, where could AI ML step in for that? Should these companies be automating more of their processes? And then, because that will fix, right, from a GRC perspective, that's going to close findings that's going to reduce the likelihood, not necessarily the impact, but the likelihood of a potential vulnerability being exploited. So where does that come in?
So I think one of the benefits that we get with AI is the fact that like when you think about pen testing, you think about this as something that will happen on a periodic basis, but it's not a continuous thing because you're having a team come in and do it, and usually that's humans and human effort, right? So the question is, are there places where we can augment having a human do this and maybe kind of do these tests continuously using some of the benefits of AI? So, one place where you might typically not have traditionally thought of having a computer do this type of work is like social engineering, right? Where like we typically think that's going to require a human mind to do that. They're going to have to do some deep dives on information about a company and reach out to potential targets and kind of harvest that back and get it. Well, now this is something where like you've seen how good the chatbots have gotten, and they now have access to information about a company. So now they have a good corpus of knowledge to start asking the right questions and automating some of this social engineering via email or even with some of the advent of like how good voice is, like using deep fakes. We can start to maybe automate some of this thing, so have continuous tests of this to constantly see how your workforce is handling this kind of social engineering, and that could be like a case where we're moving from like having this be like something that's periodically happening to continually happening, and we can start to automate away more of the things that were hard to do in the past.
Yeah, so taking those repetitive tasks, like those controls that someone's sitting there pushing a button, automate that, make sure that likelihood of a misstep or missing, that button push, so it reduces again the likelihood of something going wrong. I think that's fantastic. As someone in the security field, AI, ML this year, that's the buzzword this year. Last year it was zero trust. This year it's walking around RSA, that's what you see everywhere. So clearly this is something that we have to start paying attention to, and you hear both sides, right? Don't do it, stay away from it, privacy law, which is very valid, but then there's also this use case where, especially where it comes to pen testing and controls and process management, where it could really come in handy and start to free up your teams to do more creative things, to focus on the real risks that we're seeing that you can't automate, something that's too complex that relies, to your point, that relies on the human aspect. And that to me is almost like a new frontier to add to the complexity of technology that we have today.
Yeah, and there is that kind of play of like, there's probably a middle ground where it's like, don't avoid it completely, but like, don't just wholeheartedly embrace everything now. We're very early days in terms of like what this kind of looks like. And I think there are some developments like from Meta, you have one of the large language models, Llama, that has been shown to be, you could run this like on a laptop, right? So like, this is a case where you could move from like relying on a third party to do this, to actually moving and like running it on-prem, so you have fewer of those considerations about privacy, but you're still getting the benefits of like what the models can do, and you can maybe fine-tune those to the task that you want to perform. But like, there probably is a middle ground, like if you don't have you're not willing to entrust that data to a third party, or you don't have a third party you can trust, or they don't have the right controls that meet the regulatory compliance you need to use them, maybe moving it in-house is an option. Or in the future, maybe there will be versions of these that kind of sit kind of like even with the cloud. You have GovCloud and stuff like that have different controls in place to satisfy different legislation, and like those are things that like we just don't have in this space right now.
Yeah,
100%. I mean, I think I've got two really main focal points around that right now. So one, if I'm logged into an LLM and it tells me it has $50,000 waiting for me, I'm definitely clicking that link because I can trust it, right? It's AI.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, no, I think one of the things that whenever you talk about pen testing, I know this is one of those conversations that we never really talk about. Again, it's one of those elephants in the room. It's the ethics of a pen test, right?
Yeah.
And if we're relying on AI and ML, and we're talking about ethics-bound pen testing, or should pen testing be ethics-bound, right? Because at the end of the day, depending on the SaaS application or depending on what your company is executing, there could be a lot of sensitive data.
Yeah.
And I think you hit it a little bit that there's a middle ground, but as a pen test company, should there be an ethics obligation depending on, I guess, whether the pen test is scoped or unscoped, and what does that balance look like?
Well, that's a great question. It's a really, I hadn't even considered the ethical consideration of like the pen test here either. And this is, it's funny too, because like this, you know, especially when you're incorporating these other new technologies, you know, like there was, you know, prompt injection has been one of those kind of things that's been talked about a lot, and you have, you know, safeguards in some of these models to try to prevent it from going off the rails, but like there have been, you know, every time they create a new safeguard, there's a new thing to make it go off the rails again, and it's like, even if I could inject ethical rules in here, would it even abide by them?
Right.
And it's kind of hard to know. It's a black box at the end of the day.
That might be something you need to look into.
Yeah.
Have some research.
Yeah.
You can credit us on that. That coming up with
this
that
seems
one.
like a good new research direction right here. I like that though. That's interesting.
Well, yeah, it's the parameters and the boundaries, and would it make the right decision? If it found something, what is the logic behind there? Because from that GRC perspective, I want to dig in. If I see something, my brain always says, keep asking questions.
Yes.
Don't stop. And that's like the internal auditor as well, external auditor, where you see something and you just want to keep scratching away at it until you understand the full picture. I think you know those like pieces of paper you used to have when we were kids that were black and you had the pen, it would like be a rainbow underneath it.
Away.
Yes, that's exactly, that's how my brain works.
I was thinking lottery ticket.
That too.
The scratch off, you're like, that's where your mind went.
Okay,
I like it, I love
fine.
it.
I think about rainbows and colors and you think about money, I get it, okay?
Someone has to.
Whatever, okay? But it's a really good thing, because if I'm the one setting up the parameters and the ethics, it's going to be very different from an engineer who's going to be setting that up, or a product person,
or a customer.
Correct, right? And understanding, is that going to now breed a new type of pen tests now that you have this technology at your hands?
Right.
And I mean, I think also with that, I mean, does that change the cadence of your pen testing? Does that change the cadence of your vulnerability scanning?
Yeah.
Well, then couldn't it then just be a continuous pen test? Are you constantly going to be under the parameters of someone's done something, the AI picks up on it and looks at those controls? Is that still a pen test? Or is that vulnerability management? Where does that line become blurred if it does?
I mean, for me, I grew up under, you know, the saying, always assume breach. Yeah. Right?
Yes.
So what's the difference between always assuming pen test and always assuming breach?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of an interesting, like, a lot of interesting things to think about here, because it's one now, like, maybe with some of these, you know, where we're starting to see, you know, and these are wildly different areas, but like you're seeing people like try to capture the essence of like what an artist looks like, right? Like, let's remove the artist and say like, be a nation state for me. Like, attack me like, you know, and pick your favorite, you know, ridiculous cybersecurity name for an attack group, you know, Charming Kitten or something, like, you know, be Charming Kitten and attack me. Like, and you know, like this is maybe now something where like, you know, as we have reports that are coming about the TTPs and things like techniques, tactics, procedures, for lack of more acronyms, we don't need to litter them all in here. But, you know, that is one of those cases where maybe now, like, you know, you really are, at that point, if you're having somebody simulate attacks to you like it is one of these nation states, that kind of feels like a pen test. Right?
It does. And it goes back that now, I think, if you're able to do that and you're able to do that in the right way, I think that the SAN statistics now grow.
Right.
Yep.
You have a lot more people reporting, but also the second half of that, right, is we go back to the balance of what is the LLM going to learn?
Exactly,
and how is it going to learn how to respond?
Yeah.
Is it going to start redacting data?
But can you trust the responses that you're getting? That's the other side of that coin too. Yeah. Right? Because I mean, you've done research around ChatGPT, and some of the responses to the questions are not accurate because they're time bound as one variable, but also garbage in, garbage out. Yeah.
Well, you've got the time bound aspect, and then like, you know, what I think is kind of become popularly a term like hallucinations, of like they're kind of stating things very confidently that are very wrong. They're very good liars.
You mean I'm not one of Forbes 50 top cybersecurity people?
sometimes they get it right, but but not always.
Wow. Okay.
I was happy.
We really, roller coaster there. We want to keep
that was great.
We did full circle.
But yeah, I mean, there is that question of like, can you trust the results that are coming out of it? And this is the case now where they really kind of, I think, lend themselves to kind of a human in the loop, right? Where there's somebody that, hopefully, maybe not just any human, but like an expert human in the loop, where like it's reducing the amount of work that somebody has to do, but like, you still can't trust them fully right now, and it's not clear when that will be.
Well, just like any pen test, when we get pen test draft reports back, we always say, show us the evidence that you've done this, so we can, go through those steps and try to replicate it ourselves. So I think regardless of what comes out, you're going to go back and confirm, to verify, right? Like trust but verify, or refute. Refuting, yes, or refute. But then that's your opportunity to identify your mitigating controls, if there are any, and that's, again, risk management coming in, accepting the risk of not being able to have the resources to do something. Is it within your appetite of your organization? What are you going to focus on, as we mentioned earlier? It really starts to, I think, breed the conversation and help to enhance the security culture of your organization. So I think, this conversation around the benefits of AI and ML and pen testing, and from a risk and security, risk and compliance perspective, I'm all for it. Ethically speaking, it could have its issues, which, Chaz, I look forward to you writing a paper about this and giving me some statistics that I can use in future pen tests. But I think it's great. I think that's something that there should be research on. There should be more positive spin around the relationship of security and AI ML.
And I think this is one of those cases where you can use it to help augment a lot of the things that we currently struggle with, because, the truth of the matter, at the end of the day, there aren't enough security, people out there to do all the things that need to be done. And if there are ways that we can automate or augment some of those folks to it's not going to replace them, but it's going to maybe help them, level up and be more effective. And that's useful. And having things continuously done, that requires automation and things like that. And there's some things that are harder to automate, and this is where AI might come into play.
I think that's great. I do, and I think that we've obviously touched the roller coaster of emotions in this conversation, and roles and responsibilities. But at the end of the day, I think ultimately it comes down to people are asking for the reports, internally and externally. If you're a private company, or if you have a VC behind you, they want to know. They want to understand their investment. They want to understand the risk. I think as security stakeholders, we want to know, what can we do? What can we be doing better? How are we impacting this? How are we mitigating this? So now I guess the ultimate question is, we've talked a lot about pen testing, but is pen testing enough? Or should, as practitioners, should we be doing more? Should we be researching more? Should we not necessarily invest in more tools, but invest more in process, procedure, and review?
Exactly. And I think that's the important thing is pen testing alone isn't enough. It's going to identify the vulnerabilities, but this still means that there's a huge avenue of what do we do on the defensive side? This is offensive related. So how do we actually defend ourselves once I know what we're vulnerable against? That's where patching and figuring all these things out, and having a defensive strategy and having policies in place to help protect you against these threats in the future comes into play. And that requires a willingness to be able to do that, and some sort of agility with your organization to enable that.
Yeah, absolutely. I always have in my mind, when I create a security framework, I always think pivot, being able to pivot. I have Ross in my head screaming from Friends, pivot! Because you never know what you're going to find, and you have to be able to stop and pivot your teams and be able, your focus, to be able to be agile enough to do that. And I think if there's going to be an ability to have, AI, ML, pen testing, you should be able to have the same technology on the flip side from a defensive. So is that something that's coming? Being able to automate your oh my gosh, I have a pen test, vulnerability finding, whatever it might be here. Oh, I don't have to worry about it. It's something that I already know how to address. I've built it in. It's just going to operationalize itself.
And I think this is kind of one of the this is like one of the opportunities we have to kind of make that better, because I feel like the defensive side often kind of gets the short end of the stick from the security perspective.
Yes.
You know, everybody wants to talk about like breaking everything, but nobody wants to talk about how we fix it. Breaking's more fun sometimes, but like, you know, the fix, but the fixing's really important, and this is one of those cases where it's like, all right, I have the vulnerability, can I have it like suggest remediations for me so that I make that easier to do? Can I, have it like automatically generate policies and, like, that can be reviewed and maybe adopted and, maybe actually apply those policies to an organization, at least, present those. So like, I do think that defensive side is really important, where we might, have that opportunity with these going forward.
Yeah, and having integrations with different technologies. So if a policy is spun up, your technology is going to learn from how you respond to those policies.
Exactly.
So then if something arises in the future, it'll make the decision on its own,
right,
and apply those controls to mitigate that risk down a bit.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of interesting, because how do you then quantify and qualify to an auditor that what has happened is enough? That piece there is really interesting to me, because when I would go into an audit, I'd say, show me. Okay?
There's that scratch.
That scratch again, yes. So show me what you've done and prove to me that it's enough for me to go, got it. And I think that's a really interesting thought exercise, is how will this be addressed?
Right. And I do think that, there's probably an opportunity to have like, this is where I think metrics sometimes come into play, where it's like, it's nice sometimes to subjectively say, I think it got better, or I have this, but like, if we have things that we're able to do continuously, like to continuously scan for certain things and kind of address those, and we can have mitigations put in place, we can maybe start to empirically look at how those mitigations are actually coming into play. Like, if we had this many vulnerabilities before, and we have, automatic remediations happening, we can we should see reductions in like those things going forward. And that like helps make it a little bit more empirical in some ways. Some things it's hard to do empirically, but like there are, probably some, metrics that maybe even we can use these large language models to help us identify. Help me find metrics,
Metrics is one of my favorite things, because we always talk about KPIs.
Yes.
I prefer KRIs, key risk indicators.
Yes.
I feel like they're so underutilized, and I really feel this is an opportunity where you can see much more with AI. You're gonna learn to it, like, because a key risk indicator is supposed to say, hey, something's going wrong. Right. Pay attention. This, on a red, amber, green scale. Yeah. You're at amber. Yeah. Do something.
Right.
And the pen testing,
I don't know. I slightly disagree. I mean, I think that there's, again, it goes back to environmental variables, right?
Yeah.
If I'm not saying that we don't integrate. I 100% think we should integrate. I also think that pen test companies and vulnerability management companies should be a lot more closely aligned. Not to say that they're at odds or anything like that. I do see a direct correlation between pen testing reports and vulnerabilities going hand in hand, right?
They do,
I mean, there's this thing called, the NVD, or the National Vulnerability Database, that they kind of classifies things for us. But I often know that the risk doesn't always outweigh the reward. Right. And sometimes when you have that automation or that intelligence to go and patch something that could disrupt customer flow, it could disrupt operations, it could bring down a service that a customer's relied on. I don't know that there's any modeling, LLM or other base, that we can successfully rely on to subjugate and understand customer risk and quantify that in a way that it knows when, where, and how to patch without disrupting those.
Well, I mean, that's like, I think you make a great point about like availability and stuff like that. Like that is, one of the key like security principles in terms that people don't talk about, right? Like, there was a paper a long time ago. The academic in me loves papers. And there are 7 principles, like the Salter-Schroeder principles, and
Right.
like that's one of them. And it's like, this is one of those things where, frequently we talk about like locking things down, but if things become less available as a byproduct of that, then we've kind of made things worse in a way. So like that's another one where we can measure things like availability and uptime and stuff like that, and maybe incorporate those into the metrics that we look at. It's imperfect, nothing's going to be perfect, but...
Well, I was about to say, but doesn't that then skew your metrics, which then skews your reporting, because sometimes metrics only tell the story we allow it to tell based on the availability of information.
But, but metrics aren't meant to be static. Just like pen testing and vulnerability management, like your scope is going to change. Your metrics are going to change as your organization changes. Your appetite's going to change. If you are looking to do an acquisition of a company, you're going to accept more risk. So having a pen test come back with some moderate or low findings, you might be like, you know what, there's no highs and criticals, I accept that risk. But if you have now acquired that company and you're integrated into your systems, and all of a sudden you're going to look at that same pen test report through a different lens, and then the metrics are going to mean something different at the time. So I think it's all situational based around that.
Agreed.
Let's agree to disagree again on many things that we agree to disagree about.
No, it's just, I obviously gone through several M&As. It's a wonderful process. I suggest that everyone go through it. It's a great time.
I think we sit on different sides at that table on that one.
But again, I mean, and obviously I'm in customer success, and customers love metrics. They do. They love metrics. But I mean, even to the point of vulnerability reporting, those metrics are often misnomered because what system was available whenever you were doing your vulnerability scanning? Right? Maybe that risk hadn't been introduced yet, which is why I do agree that there are a lot of things that should be continuous, and scope should always change, and we should be a lot more agile than we appear to be. We should be pivoting.
Pivoting, always pivoting. But like going back to kind of like the elephant in the room around like pen testing and like the GRC perspective on things, like I obviously look at, as a CISO as well, like look at pen testing as a necessity.
Right.
But I like the thought of continuous pen testing, just like we do continuous vulnerability scanning, right? I mean, a lot of companies do. And this continuous pen testing and scratching, if you will, I think it's really important because it makes for a better product. It makes for a better experience for your customers. If you're able to address something up front, you're not going to end up, as the next headline, right? And no customer wants it. No company wants that from your brand perspective. Your brand risk is huge. So I think, from my perspective, the more we can integrate machine learning and AI into our environments responsibly and ethically, paper to come soon, you're only going to benefit from it. And pen testing will become, it won't be a dirty word anymore, right? It won't be something that scares everybody, because it's just going to become part of the process. I mean, it should have been a long time ago, obviously. Let's be honest, it just hasn't gotten there yet. Now I think through AI and ML it will. And, I would just love to understand like your final thoughts on this. Do you have any like reservations about this? Do you think this is revolutionary?
I mean, I think it's one of those like tough things where it comes with like, I think there are a lot of but there's a lot of potential and a lot of like things that could come out of it, but it also kind of with all that good, there's a lot of like negative things that could happen from it as well. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag where we're like the actual implementation of it is going to be really, that's the proof's in the pudding. Like there's a lot of like there's a lot of good possibility that we can do great things, but like I think it's really going to come down to how the implementation actually happens. And again, like this is with anything in security, it's like we have a lot of great ideas, but sometimes they're not implemented or executed the best. And so this is one of those places for AI where I think there are a lot of things that we struggle with, and it can help us with those. But like there are a lot of considerations that need to be done.
Well, it's iterations, right?
It is iteration. It's
very much like ML. You have to learn from it and continue to make it better yourself too.
Yeah, and I think so. I think over time we'll get better and better and better at this. But I think there won't be any quick fixes or silver bullets in the near future. It's just going to be it's going to be a journey.
I know we talk a lot about the implementation of things, right? There's 3 phases. There's crawl, there's walk, there's run.
Yeah.
I think that we're not even to the crawl at this point, right? I think that we've got the bright shining star, and we're starting to scoot along in our diaper towards that.
That is a very descriptive picture. Thank you.
Yeah. You can see the baby.
Yes, I can. I can see it. Thank you. That's great.
I can absolutely see. I see the bright star.
Yeah.
All right. I see the positives. I do worry about the negatives. Yeah. I love the quick reaction or the implication to be able to deliver something to a customer quickly. That's both human readable and digestible, where it doesn't scare them, but also still keep that primary internal focus on the language that we need to speak to our internal executive leadership or engineering and research, so that we're focusing on the right things, we're setting the right KRIs, and we're maintaining that goal. So Kayla, I mean, I guess as a CISO, as executive leader, someone who's been in business decision making, when it comes to pen testing and GRC, what is the last thing that you want to say on why it's important?
Ooh, it's important because it gives you the opportunity to be proactive. It identifies things that sometimes teams don't want to hear, but need to hear. And it gives you the transparency to make the business decisions, because it's resources, it's people, and it's money, and it's time. AI and ML is going to disrupt this. You know, we're going to be able to learn about our environments, to quickly pivot to a potential, I'm sorry, I'm like so into this word now, and be able to address the findings that we have more quickly with human intervention to make sure that's right until we start to iterate again and again and learn. But you know, I think it's one of those topics that, you know, do you trust your pen test company? Do you trust your GRC team and security team? And I think that's a bigger conversation around the culture of your organization, because if you're contracting with someone to do a pen test, or it's a continuous pen test through AI, you have to build in the parameters and the trust there.
Right.
And then you shouldn't be able to dispute the validity of the findings until you go back and check them yourselves, right? You know, trust but verify, I think, is one of those things that has been around for a really long time, and we are just in a really good place to put that into like operations, right? I mean, right, we're scooting along in a diaper,
it's gonna keep going.
and you know, we're gonna keep going, and the next technology is gonna come around, and you know, maybe that's quantum computing. Right, that's the next one. That's a different podcast, but that's another risk that's coming. And you know, we're gonna have more iterations on things and it's just gonna change and continue to evolve and get bigger.
Yeah.
So it's like, get on board now with pen testing, getting, you know, the AI ML, trusting that it's right, verifying that it's right. And then, you know, using your GRC team or your internal audit team if you don't have one, or just a security consultant to help you to operationalize the fixes based on your corporate priorities.
That was an extremely long hot take. But
it is extremely long. I could keep going. It's just one of those things. I'm energized.
No,
I'm pivoting.
I'm pivoting. So first, you know, Kayla, first episode, sitting beside each other.
Yeah.
Thanks for meeting me here at RSAC conference. A huge shout out to Marco and Sean for inviting us to do this
thank you.
here at RSAC conference. And then, speaking of pivoting, Chaz.
Hey, Dr. Chaz.
Dr. Chaz.
Oh, happy to be here.
Really glad you were able to join us. I think it was a great conversation, and I think we should probably do another one where, you know, we dive a little bit deeper, maybe into quantum or, you know, threat research. I think there's a slew of subjects we could go on and on hours and hours about. But for today, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up, and let's get back to the conference and hopefully find some good food and drinks.
Oh, definitely that for sure.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
Great.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and this story made you think, then share ITSPmagazine with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our columns. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.